Good morning. I'm Will Tobey. I'm a senior fellow at the Belfer Center. I served on the National Security Council staff in 3 administrations, the Reagan and both Bush administrations, in positions related to arms control, defense policy, and nonproliferation. I also was a deputy administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, and I attended the 6-party talks for several years in the 2000s. So I'm going to talk today about how escalation might occur in the North Korea context. And Jim and I have had our differences over the years. We once had a shouting match standing in the aisle of a shuttle flight to DC. But I think he did an excellent job of outlining the potential sources of escalation. And I think actually you'll see in my brief talk about how things might get out of control in the North Korea context, he's already brought out several of the ways in which that would be possible. But I think one of the foremost points that I would say, while I agree with his analysis of the sources of instability, my guess, and it's only a guess because I think you have to approach this topic with some humility, is that North Korean planners probably wouldn't. His list of things that are paradoxes about the nuclear context that must be accepted, that aren't generally accepted in the context of conventional arms and doctrine, probably don't exist in the minds in Pyongyang. And that's something I think to bear in mind. So my first point would be that one of humility, that it's really hard to know, if you're going to look at sources of escalation beyond control, you have to know what the North Koreans are thinking. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to do it because it's the most opaque nation on earth. It's hard to do it because they actually have deception as part of their military doctrine. And remember, Jim said, one of the sources of instability is that the sides may be trying to game each other. And how deterrence depends weirdly on a modicum of trust about what the other side will do and under what circumstances. And then it's the third reason why it's probably difficult to know what the North Koreans are thinking about their nuclear weapons is that, in my guess is that their doctrine is evolving. Most states, as they attain nuclear weapons, have changed their doctrine relatively quickly. Very likely their doctrine is a mix of Soviet and Chinese military doctrine and is heavily influenced by their conventional warfighting aims. We can see this actually in how they have talked about nuclear weapons. And they talk about nuclear weapons publicly anyway. And again, the point of humility, we don't know whether what they're saying publicly is really the truth, what they're really thinking, but it is what we have to go on. They see 2 purposes for nuclear weapons. Actual warfighting, to repel the attack that might come across the border at them, and to strike at depth, to effectively deter or dissuade the United States from prosecuting a war. I would add that there is a third element that they don't talk about, but one that I would observe, which is a certain fatalism. The North Koreans view the world with a sense of grievance. They believe that they are the afflicted party. And they also believe that force is the only answer to use of force. As I said, it's an opaque society, but there have been glimpses. Some of the Soviet files, when they were dealing with North Koreans, have become public, and there are memoranda of conversations between North Korean and Soviet diplomats in the context of a crisis in 1969 when the North Koreans shot down an EC-121, a U.S. Spy plane. And the Soviets went to the North Koreans and said, the Americans have mobilized their forces, and we think there's a possibility that they will attack. And you should be careful about what you do. And the North Korean response, now, admittedly, maybe this was bluster, although it was 2 allies at the time, speaking in the context of what was thought to be a secret conversation, was fatalistic. The Americans are going to do what they have to do. We have to meet force with force, so we have to do what we have to do. And if that results in war, so be it. That's just the way it is. I don't know whether Kim Jong-un has changed the way that they look at conflict or not, but my guess is that there's a certain continuity. If you force me to bet on the question, I would say there's more continuity than not. So that's the mindset that I think that we're thinking about. Um, so, specifically, what are the dangers of escalation? Jim has already alluded to several, and I agree with all of those. I'll drill down on one or two of those. So there has been this trial balloon, and we don't know whether it's a serious one or not, about a so-called bloody nose attack. There have been relatively detailed discussions about that. My friend Victor Cha reportedly was not hired as the ambassador to Seoul because he opposed such a thing, and yet it's been denied. So I don't know exactly where that is going, but it obviously was something that people have thought about. The problem of it is that the logic asks you to hold in mind contradictory assumptions. First, that Kim is so unstable that he cannot be reliably deterred. What Jim, again, alluded to in terms of, I'm not willing to put my population at risk of a decision by a guy who is an unstable, ill-informed dictator. But you also have to assume that simultaneously that Kim will be able to assess accurately that a bloody nose attack does not threaten his hold on power. Because if it does, then he believes that he will have no choice. And remember, too, that their overall sort of military assumption is you have to meet force with force. I would add that, well, you could say, well, we could have a declaratory policy that announces that this is simply a bloody nose attack. Well, that has problems, too. It's sort of similar to how when Secretary Kerry said that the attacks on Syria would be unbelievably small. Well, if Assad knows that the attacks are going to be unbelievably small, it's unlikely that they're going to change his behavior. So if it's a bloody nose attack that isn't going to lead to much more, it isn't really going to affect its purpose. But I would also add there's a sort of opposite risk that Kim may regard that as strategic deception on the part of the United States and not believe it and treat it as a real attack. Second thing I'd like to talk about are long-term dangers, or at least longer-term, 5 to 10-year dangers, which I don't think are getting much attention. And these are dangers that could lead to escalation. And the primary driver of them is the growing abundance of fissile material in North Korea. The publicly available Defense Intelligence Agency assessment is that they may have some 60 weapons. That's the high end of the estimates I've seen. But even if it's in the 30 to 50 range, it's a fair number of weapons at this point. And they're probably growing, and again, we don't know because we don't know exactly how many fissile material production facilities they have, at a level of about 5 weapons per year. So by 2025, they might have as many as 100 weapons. It's a fair number of nuclear weapons. In my view, that makes the situation more dangerous along 5 vectors. First, it will lead to a more dangerous force structure, doctrine, and posture on the part of North Korea. They will have nuclear weapons deployed on a day-to-day basis, very likely in the field, probably mobile, and probably ready to go on short alert. Second, it will make more nuclear testing possible. In the 2000s, my view was that their ability to test nuclear weapons was limited by fissile material. If you've only got 2, 3, or 4 weapons, you didn't want to waste them. In fact, I had heard people in the government say after the first test, well, let's see you do that again, because that would only diminish their stocks. But as they are able to test weapons, they will have both better weapons design and delivery system designs, and that will make their systems far more capable. And we're seeing that with the longer range missile systems. Third, sales will become more likely. So if you've only got enough fissile material for a few weapons, it's unlikely that you're going to be willing to sell a weapon or fissile material. But if you've got enough for 100 weapons, does it matter much whether you've got 95 or 100? But does it matter to the United States if, say, some other nation now all of a sudden has 5 nuclear weapons? That's a big problem. Fourth, the possibility of accidental or unauthorized launch becomes greater as systems are deployed in the field and on day-to-day alert. And then fifth, the possibility of theft of a weapon or fissile material is greater as more and more material or weapons are created. Now you might say, well, this is a police state and that's highly unlikely, but it's also a very poor state, and it's one that, at least we hope, at some point will face some political instability so that the population will not be subjected to the depredations of the current government. My final point is probably the most obvious one, but I think it demands to be said. In the event of general conflict, there will almost certainly be nuclear use by North Korea. The only question will be where and how many. So will they use a few weapons against Osan and Kunsan air bases, maybe against the port of Busan, in order to slow an American attack? Will they attack American bases at Yokosuka and Sasebo in Japan, which, by the way, are near cities? Will they attack Guam, Hawaii, or the continental United States? All those are possibilities. Now, there are missile defenses. Those missile defenses, as Jim mentioned, are not perfect. We can argue about exactly how capable they are, but once nuclear weapons start flying around, obviously the dangers are increased significantly. Thank you.